After America is made on the lands of the Bunurong and Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Hi, I'm Emma Shortis and this is After America. The MAGA movement has always been defined by gutter racism.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
Black voters have been great to me. I've been great to them. And I am, by the way, the least racist president you've had in a long time, as far as I'm concerned.
This week, the president reminded us of one of the things that has always driven him: anger and resentment that a black man was elected president before he was. On Truth Social, Trump reposted a video with an appallingly racist depiction of the Obamas. The post was deleted, but Trump refused to apologise. It won't hurt him. It never really does. Racism has also driven the right-wing response to the cultural touchstone that is the Super Bowl halftime show. The star, Bad Bunny, is the first to win a Grammy for Best Album for a work entirely in Spanish.
Before I say thanks to God, I'm gonna say eyes out.
You can imagine the response from the MAGAverse. The Super Bowl has become a kind of avatar for the political and cultural wars consuming the United States. The president wouldn't go, he said, because of the choice of Bad Bunny. Trump wants to control American culture and creativity, as he increasingly controls elements of the American media. And he is deeply resentful of his own movement's inability to create genuine beauty, to generate the kind of joy and solidarity that Bad Bunny brought to the Super Bowl. That drive for control animates Trump and the people around him. His victory in 2024 was a generational one for the American right. They have the presidency, the Congress, and the Supreme Court. They will not give that up without a fight.
The Republicans should say, we want to take over. We should take over the voting in at least 15 places. The Republicans ought to nationalize the voting.
American democracy teeters on the brink. But here in Australia, our government is busy pretending that everything is just fine. The Albanese government is full steam ahead on the AUKUS submarine deal and complicit in the destruction of international law. But it doesn't have to be this way. With me this week to talk through what's happening in the United States and how the Australian government is responding is Ben Doherty. Ben is a senior reporter for Guardian Australia, covering Australian foreign policy and international affairs. He's a former foreign correspondent covering South and Southeast Asia, and he's won 3 Walkley Awards for his foreign and immigration reporting. Ben, thanks so much for joining us on After America. It's so great to have you.
Pleasure to be with you, Emma. Thanks for the invitation.
Pleasure's all ours. Hey, Ben, I wanted to start by asking you, because it's, breaking news for us as we're recording. The Washington Post in the US has just laid off a stack of reporters, and particularly reporters on climate change. Of course, you report on security and foreign policy and international affairs. Climate is a security threat. It's an issue for international affairs. It's an issue for the Trump administration. What does it mean when so much capacity is being stripped from newsrooms like this?
I mean, I think capacity is the right way to sort of look at this. Democracy dies in darkness is the Washington Post's credo. Someone just turned the lights out of the Washington Post. You know, this sort of bloodletting within the Washington Post, as you say, targeting of specific areas where the need for accountability has never been greater. And I think it is just reducing the capacity of a once proud newspaper like the Washington Post to hold governments to account. There is this attempt to stifle and to control and to sort of even eviscerate the media in order for governments to be able to do what they want to do and to do it in secrecy. I mean, the Washington Post is literally the paper that brought you Watergate. And now there are fewer and fewer reporters being asked to do more and more. We've seen overt editorial influence in a place like the Washington Post, you know, the Kamala Harris endorsement being pulled, editorial cartoons being pulled. Like, this is not a free paper anymore. The US has a First Amendment, but we are increasingly seeing pressure being brought to bear on that freedom of speech in other ways. It's a really It's a dark day for the Washington Post. It's a dark day for journalism. It's a dark day for democracy in that country.
Yeah, it is, and it doesn't seem like it's going to get better anytime soon.
The United States is completely supportive of AUKUS, as the President of the United States made clear.
Because we're just going now full steam ahead building.
The direction of the President, AUKUS, is full steam ahead.
What happens if, in fact, you don't get any submarines? What's your plan B? They just say there's no need for plan B. How anybody would think this was a smart deal to do is completely beyond me.
You mentioned there accountability and transparency, which brings me, I think, to some of the reporting that you've been doing recently on the AUKUS nuclear-powered submarine deal between Australia and the United States. So I also wanted to ask you where you think that deal is at, where it's heading.
Look, it is a huge and very complex deal. It is also one of these, it's very hard to kind of get across because the time span is so long. And then, you mentioned accountability there. No one who's in office now making decisions now, or who was in office in 2021 making this decision, is going to be around to be responsible for when this does or doesn't work. There's a kind of total lack of accountability because of the necessarily long lead times on this. But I think, to your other point around transparency, that's what has always lacked from this AUKUS deal. That's what needs to happen. And it does feel like a lot of the debate here has sort of descended. Not quite, I think tribalism is probably too strong, but there are definitely these sort of camps emerging. People who are very pro-AUKUS and it's kind of all the way with Donald J, or it's AUKUS is this white elephant, this sort of absurdly wasteful military boondoggle that's never going to work. And these two camps are sort of talking past each other. And part of the reason for that is because of this sort of abject failure of process in the way it was just deposited on the Australian people. We literally woke up one morning to, we are now buying nuclear submarines from the US and we're going to build our own nuclear submarines with the help of the UK. That's oversimplifying a very, very big, very, very expensive deal. But that fundamental problem has kind of dogged AUKUS ever since, is we don't know what we've signed up for. We don't know what we're getting. And the more we look into this, the more troubling it seems on a number of levels. What we're seeing increasingly from the US is these, what were sort of quite subtle warnings becoming increasingly overt, as it's been described by some commentators, saying the quiet part out loud. The US saying, your chances of getting Virginia-class submarines are increasingly narrow. This is the first element of Pillar 1 of AUKUS, is that the US is going to sell us 3 Virginia-class submarines beginning in 2032. On the political side, everyone is on board. Donald Trump literally said, full steam ahead, we're building away, it's all happening. The thing is, it's not going to be Donald Trump's decision to make. If the 22nd Amendment's worth the paper it's written on, he's not going to be president in 2031, 2032 when this decision needs to be made. That is a big if, but let's hold to it for the moment. It's not Donald Trump's decision to make. It's not a political decision. There is legislation that says the US is not allowed to sell submarines to Australia if it's going to degrade the US's capabilities, if the US needs those submarines for its own Navy. At the moment, it doesn't have enough submarines for its own Navy. It's not making enough for its own needs. There are no submarines to sell to Australia. And the US is saying this. The US is, the Congressional Research Service, which we've been reporting about this week, is saying, look, these rates of building of submarines just won't move. We need to build 2 a year for our own needs. We need to build 2.33 a year to sell some to Australia. At the moment, we're building 1.1, 1.2 submarines a year. So that hasn't moved, even with the injection of lots of money, a lot of it coming from Australia to try and build this. The submarines just aren't there. And the US is now, within the US Congress, is now openly contemplating saying, well, do we actually want to sell these submarines to Australia because we want to use them for ourselves? If we give them to Australia, we can't order them into a conflict with China over Taiwan. And this is overtly being said, if they are retained under US command, perhaps sailed out of Australian bases, we have the right to deploy them where we want to use them. This is not an abstract sort of wargaming theory or people speculating. This is the US Congressional Service writing to Congress saying these are issues for Congress to decide and talk about. This is a live question in the US right now. And it's happening as we speak, but there is a sort of, Pollyanna-ish is too strong, but there's a sort of denial going on in Australia. Australia saying, no, it's all happening. It's full steam ahead, sort of dismissing this as commentary or just speculation. But it's not. It's much more serious than that. It's the US saying, look, this is what we are actively contemplating. And it's part of the deal. The AUKUS deal is that If the US feels it doesn't have any submarines to spare, it doesn't sell them to Australia and we don't get them. And that's not them. That's not the US reneging on the deal. That's the US upholding the deal. That's what was signed up to.
I just wanted to ask you about that because you mentioned, of course, that, President Donald Trump has said we're full steam ahead on AUKUS. He's fully on board with the deal. The Congressional Research Service report that you mentioned actually kind of said that the review of AUKUS that happened within the US Defense Department was kind of rejigged because the president said he was in favour of this deal. And Richard Marles, the Australian Defence Minister's response to this report seems to have been, the president said, like, full steam ahead. You've heard the president say this, end of story. I mean, am I too incredulous to think, like, it's wild? Like, are we really trusting Donald Trump to keep his word on this?
I don't think that's wild at all. I think that's a very reasonable skepticism, particularly when you look at this is not going to be just a political decision to make. Of course, it needs political impetus behind us, but there is a legislative framework around this. And yes, trusting Donald Trump, a man who has betrayed allies, who coerces allies, and who overtly talks about an America First strategy that will happily discard alliances, will bully other countries, will renege on deals. I think relying on full steam ahead in 2025 from Donald Trump for a deal that's going to come through in 2032 is incredibly naive, is sort of wishful thinking of the highest order. And it's a really dangerous thing to do because these are seriously consequential decisions.
Consequential for a number of reasons, not least the cost, which is something I wanted to ask you about because, reading through this Congressional Research Service report that we're talking about, there is some outline of some of the money that's been committed by Australia, which is roughly speaking in US dollars, $3 billion to our own industry, $3 billion to the US shipbuilding industry, and $3 billion to the UK shipbuilding industry. But from my reading of it, it's not actually clear how much the Australian government has already handed over and where that money is going. There doesn't seem to be any transparency around this, even from the Congressional Research Service report, which is very good and very granular in its detail.
I think that's right. I think that's really troubling. We talked earlier about transparency, and there is just vanishingly little transparency around how that money's being spent, where it's being directed, at whose discretion it's being spent, and basically what sort of bang for our buck are we getting. I think you're right. From the US side, there tends to be more accountability and transparency about these things, but it does seem to be that we've dedicated to this point about $3 billion to the US shipbuilding industry to support AUKUS, but we don't know what we're getting for that. And there are certainly no guarantees at the end of that we are getting anything out of that. So a skeptic can argue that, this is kind of a tribute almost. This is kind of paying for the alliance for the protection of the great and powerful friend. I mean, in lots of respects, Australia's kind of always done that. We have a small military compared to the US, but the things we can contribute to the alliance are, real estate, Pine Gap, Harold Holt Listening Station, Tyndall Air Base. All of these bases are really valued by the US defence establishment. They give the US, the power to look over the horizon kind of thing and keep the US in the Pacific. But this money being paid into the US with very little transparency or accountability about it feels more like that sort of Australia sort of paying into the alliance, paying for protection.
Yeah, that we may not get.
We may or may not get. Yeah, it really is. I think your original point is a very sound one. Like, how much can we rely upon this? We've seen what's happened to NATO, threatening NATO allies with literal invasion.
If we don't take Greenland, Russia or China will take Greenland. And I am not going to let that happen. But one way or the other, we're going to have Greenland. We are going to do something on Greenland, whether they like it or not.
When you sort of say that, you go, really? Go, yes, he did threaten to invade Greenland, which is part of Denmark, which is a NATO ally, and been a really loyal US ally, one that had already had a defence agreement with. So, things that sound impossible, we now live in a universe where these things are absolutely realistic and need to be contemplated.
Yeah. I want to come back to that. But just before I do, Ben, like, we've been talking about transparency a lot, especially around AUKUS and this Congressional Research Service report that gives us, so much detail. It is like, what is it like for you as a journalist when we've got a situation where you actually get more information about something that's of critical importance to Australia from the US than you do from Australia?
Yeah, I mean, frustrating is one word for it. I can think of some others. Look, I do think that's deeply troubling. But I mean, your journalistic antennae are raised immediately when people don't want to give you answers, when there aren't clear answers, when there is a kind of a fallback to sort of the same sort of pro forma lines or sort of almost reflexive answers. You know, you try to interrogate this and you really don't get too far. As you say, when another country is able to provide you more information about what's happening, I think that's a deeply troubling state of affairs. You know, you're paying for this AUKUS project. I'm paying it for it. Every Australian taxpayer is paying for this. We are buying these nuclear submarines, or we are buying the concept of perhaps getting some nuclear submarines, but we're paying for it today. And that's money that can be spent elsewhere. That's money that we don't know what we're getting for it. And I think that's a really troubling state. We've spoken about the need for transparency and accountability in democracies, and I feel we have almost none of it in this circumstance. Look, I understand in matters of national security, there does need to be, care taken, and there are things that governments have to try to do in secret, but I just think the level of secrecy around AUKUS is far too great, and it's deeply troubling.
It is. And I mean, it must be especially difficult, Ben, that lack of transparency, the lack of accountability, alongside what you were talking about before, where you're trying to cover Trump, the Trump phenomenon at the same time, where you have things that seem impossible, like the total fracturing of NATO or a US invasion of Greenland, kind of happening before our eyes. How do you grapple as a journalist with covering Trump and the difficulty that many still seem to have, especially governments, in like actually taking him seriously?
The news cycle has been speeding up for a long time, but it does feel incredibly condensed in the age of Donald Trump. He is his own news weather cycle. He changes the news cycle. As a journalist living in Australia, you wake up every morning and you say, he did what? And it's kind of scrabbling to kind of understand that. And I think we are slowly coming to terms with the fact that really anything is possible. The old mores, the old certainties, the old norms, to talk in the sort of language of international relations, they don't exist anymore. These things that were once impossible, that were once inconceivable, are absolutely possible, and they have to be contemplated. Part of Australia's issue is that in our alliance, Australia is so tightly bound to the US. We almost need as a protective blanket to go, things are normal, it's still the old US, it's still the country and the nation and the superpower we could rely on. But at the same time, we're seeing this place that isn't that. For Australia to continue to act as though everything is normal, as though this is a normal administration, and that even after Donald Trump leaves office, things will snap back, I think is naive. I think things have changed. Things have changed structurally in the US. It is a different country. This is the global superpower. And for us to pretend that the old order still exists is naive and incredibly dangerous. Australia needs to understand that we do live in a different world now.
Ben, my sense of that is actually that the Australian community, kind of broadly speaking, is actually kind of across that a bit more than the government. And you've actually written about this in a really interesting way in covering things like the numbers of Australians who are travelling to the US, which I think is an interesting reflection of how the broader Australian community is actually feeling about what's happening there.
I think you're right. It does feel like the Australian public is ahead of the government on this. The Australian public is like, this is not the America we know. This is not the ally we can trust and rely on. And the way that is kind of evidenced is by exactly things like that. People saying, well, I don't want to go to the United States. I'm seeing what ICE are doing on the streets of Minnesota and elsewhere. I'm seeing the rhetoric that's coming out of that place. I'm seeing, the levels of violence. I don't want to be part of that. And at an institutional level, governments in the defence establishment, particularly, people are much more closely tied to the US and sort of holding on to this mirage, I suppose, of a US that once existed and people want to bring back into being. But I think the Australian people are much more realistic and perhaps much more clear-eyed, and they're saying that's not the America that we grew up with, and we recognise I don't want anything to do with that America, and they're voting with their feet, kind of thing.
Yeah. I'm conscious of time, Ben, but I guess I wanted to follow up on that because I think we've kind of come to it in a roundabout way. But you mentioned, the America we thought we knew is gone. It's not coming back. The Australian community is kind of recognising that. Someone else who's recognised that very explicitly is the Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney. We've talked about his speech a lot on the show. I think you've kind of previewed your answer already, but what's your sense about how the Australian government is responding to that kind of naming of reality, if at all?
Yeah, look, Anthony Albanese is not Mark Carney, and he's a kind of incrementalist, a sort of pragmatist, what's possible, and he's a very cautious operator, particularly on the international stage. I think. I think Australia's balancing a lot of things at the moment. Like, it's not just AUKUS, it's not just the alliance. There's a lot going on with the US relationship. We've got a new ambassador going in. The Board of Peace is a great example of that. I saw it described on social media as the United Donations, which I thought was excellent. I wish I'd come up with that line. This sort of megalomaniac almost Board of Peace, where all the power is invested in the chairman, in the person of Donald Trump, not in the office of the President of the United States, in the person of Donald Trump. And this kind of, it's a pay to play model. You pay your $1 billion, you get a seat forever sort of thing. Australia was offered that. Canada was offered that. You saw the way Carney responded. Carney responded with this absolute no. We are not part of that. We are committed to the United Nations and genuine multilateralism. And for his speech at Davos and for that rejection, he was kind of slapped down by Donald Trump. Anthony Albanese has responded in a very Anthony Albanese way. Look, we'll consider this. We'll look at this. We want to understand the machinations of it. We remain committed to all of these sort of the usual epithets and aphorisms. I can understand why Australia's responded in that way. That sort of caution. Australia wants to get to know on the Board of Peace. Like, everybody you talk to inside government is sort of saying, look, I don't think that's something we can be part of. And you just need to look at who said yes and who said no and decide, the company you keep kind of thing, which side of the fence you want to fall on. But it's also how you get to know for Australia. Australia really feels, particularly at the moment, it needs to it doesn't want to put its head up above the parapet and upset the person who is a very capricious occupant of the Oval Office, who turns on allies. You saw what he did to Zelensky in the Oval Office. You just need to be very careful of the, frankly, quite fragile ego of the man sitting behind the Resolute desk at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. So Australia needs to find a way to inch towards no, which I think is where Australia is almost certainly going to end up. But I think that demonstrates the way Australia is going to try to manage this, particularly for the next 3 years. And it's a long time, given how quickly Donald Trump moves from one thing to the next. There's a lot for Australia to manage in that time. But I think we're getting a sense of how Australia is going to try to get through that is by kind of just edging its way to where it needs to be without upsetting the president. It's, frankly, an extraordinary way to have to run international relations, and particularly international relations with the world superpower. But I'm not sure that it's not the best course of action, that this is exactly the way you need to kind of, you need to behave with this White House. It really is uncharted territory for the Australian government. And I think Australia needs to recognise that this is unlike any other time in this relationship with the US, this fundamental relationship that's been the bedrock of our security for 70 odd years.
Yeah. And I think that it calls for a different approach is so important, we really need to get to that starting point, I guess.
It's a different board game. Like, Donald Trump has come in and just tipped all the pieces on the floor and we're playing a new game, and to pretend that we're still playing, that's a terrible analogy.
No, it's a good one.
You know what I mean? Like, we were kind of quietly playing chess sort of thing, and then he's just come and kicked the board over, and now we're throwing mud at each other. I don't know. Anyway, like, you know what I'm trying to say? Like, it's like we live in a different world, and Australia needs to recognise that, and the old sort of diplomatic niceties and platitudes aren't going to cut it anymore.
No, certainly not with this president. Hey, Ben, I know you're on deadline. I just wanted to say we appreciate so much you taking the time to talk to us and the reporting that you're doing, which is really critical to our understanding of Australian foreign policy and where it's headed. So thank you. And I hope you'll come back on the show because I've got lots more questions for you.
It'll be a pleasure. I always enjoy our conversations. Thanks so much, Emma.
Pleasure. Thanks, Ben. Thanks so much for joining us for this week's episode. The latest Vantage Point essay, What We Owe the Water, It's Time for a Fossil Fuel Treaty, is available now from Australia Institute Press. Written by South African human rights and environmental justice advocate Kumi Naidoo, the essay argues that Australia stands at a profound crossroads. It can continue to fuel the climate crisis as one of the world's largest fossil fuel exporters, or it can become a true partner to its Pacific neighbours and lead the transition toward a fossil fuel-free future. You can buy this edition for $19.95. Pod listeners can get free shipping by using the code PODVP, that's PODVP, at checkout. You can also become a subscriber to the Vantage Point series. For just $64.95, you'll get 4 engaging essays a year on some of the most pressing issues facing Australia and the world. Visit australiainstitute.org.au/store or follow the link in the show notes to order now. This episode was recorded on Friday the 6th of February. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation and produced by Angus Blackman. We'll be back next week. I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks for listening.